Our study shows that 56% of the cobalt marker was found in the rumen right at slaughtering.
Wow. Welcome back, everyone, to the Dairy Science Digest. This is a podcast designed to bring the Journal of Dairy Science straight to the ears of dairy producers. My name is Reagan Bluel from the University of Missouri Dairy Team, and our guest today, Dr. Marcondes, comes to us from the Minor Agriculture Research Institute in Chazy, New York. And he's here today to discuss this month's article in press at the Journal of Dairy Science, which is titled The Influence of Different Amounts of Milk Replacer on Esophageal Leakage, rumen fermentation characteristics, GI passage rates, and crude protein synthesis of nursing animals. So I don't know about you. I need to admit that when I'm choring and I'm feeding those calves, those hutch heifers every day, sometimes just the act of getting the job done prevents me from really thinking deeply about what's actually happening at each and individual chore as we deliver that milk replacer and grain to the future of our dairy herd. So how is that milk really nourishing the animal, and what are the kinetics of digestion, and how is that developing her intestines for a successful future? To best understand this digestive kinetics, Doc, your team employed a group of lambs or kids to monitor the digestion of this milk replacer and how it flows through the animal. Let's pause right there and take a moment to welcome you, Dr. Marcondes, to Dairy Science Digest. If you'd be so kind to please give the listeners an introduction.
Yes, Riga, thank you so much. Thank you all for listening to this podcast. I'm originally from Brazil. My grandfather had a small beef farm in Brazil, so I was always going to the beef farm. And he had maybe 20 or 30 dairy cows. So I was always intrigued with agriculture. So I did all my studies over there in animal sciences. So I'm an animal scientist. Did my master's and PhD in rumen nutrition. Then I became a faculty in a big university in Brazil. It's called Federal University of Viçosa, one of the big land-grant universities in Brazil. Mm-hmm. And then in 2021, I moved to Washington State University, where I worked for about 4 years. Mm-hmm. And then October last year, I moved to the Minor Institute as a dairy research scientist. So that's a very brief history of myself for the audience.
That's awesome. And so let's just get the elephant out of the room quickly. While I suspect that we might have a few listeners who milk sheep, I bet the vast majority of our listeners are out there are in the bovine world. So can these kids be used as a model for bovine calves? Is it relevant for dairy cattle producers?
Yeah, that was exactly the idea, right? Although we do understand some differences, kids are a little more active than cats. There is always likelihood of them walking around and jumping, and they are more active animals than cats. Although we really think that the physiology is very similar during those early days.
Awesome.
Actually, we did it all to mimic the cat. So the volumes of milk we use on a metabolic body weight would represent 4 and 8 liters per day, because we want exactly to look at those main groups. We have a lot of calf ranches still using 4 liters per day in the US, especially with males.
Yep.
And most of our dairy farmers are going towards 8 liters per day. So we wanted to mimic exactly those two scenarios in this study. So we converted into a metabolic body weight, and then into kids body weight, and then into 1 and 2 liters per day. So that was exactly our intention, to mimic the calf world.
I can't lie. I'm so relieved to hear you say that. I was hopeful that was what you were going to say. Let's take a jog down memory lane and kind of a little bit of literature review. Can you talk about the esophageal groove and kind of the kinetics that we know so far about the calf from the historical research? What we know, and then what you were seeking to learn.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, so that's an excellent question, because from this past 50 years, we always considered 100% of the protein from the milk replacer as RUP, right? So rumen undegradable protein. Even newest models like Nascent 2021 or UNRC or even Cornell system, they all consider that 100% of the protein in milk will flow directly into the abomasum and then will be digested into the small intestine. There are a few studies showing some esophageal groove leakage.
Mm-hmm.
However, we don't have that number. And
Mm-hmm.
figuring out that number is much harder than we think.
Yeah.
So there are like two things, right? So there are some studies using ultrasound trying to mimic that effect.
Hmm.
The problem with those is that you have to restrain the animals. You're feeding the animal while the animal is all restrained, all stressed. So that you kind of change the physiology of the animal. So
Yes.
we thought like we need to feed those animals in a natural way so they're relaxed. They think that the only thing is going to happen with them.
Mm-hmm.
So we switched to using markers and then harvesting animals a few time points after harvest. Our main goal in the end was to estimate microbial protein
Mm-hmm.
uh, in those animals.
Mm-hmm.
However, to estimate microbial protein, we would need to know first how much is the protein intake for the rumen, right? So how
Mm-hmm.
much is leaking into the rumen. Second, we would need to know the rumen pool and the passage rate. Only when we have all the 3 points of this triangle, we
Can you
can estimate
calculate?
microbial potency.
Yeah, right.
Yeah,
And
exactly.
knowing that microbial protein's so important. One of the things that I want to pull or tease out of your lit review is talking about how all functional classes of rumen microorganisms are already stable in the rumen of this pre-weaned
Correct.
calf from 14 to
Hmm.
42 days of age. That floored me. I guess, we're always talking about that milk going to the abomasum, and yes, maybe some leaks out, but I guess I didn't understand that all of those microorganisms are there. And so if something does leak, then that gives some opportunity. And so can can you speak to how
Hmm.
amazing microbial protein is to serving the protein needs of a bovine, just in general?
Oh, in general, that's like super important, right? So when we're talking about like cows, we're talking about maybe 45 to 65% of the entire protein that is absorbed in the small intestine coming from that microbial protein, right? And in beef animals, it's even higher because they rely much more on rumen degradable protein. So it's even more important. When you have like grazing cows on pasture, for instance, great majority of that protein absorbed in the small intestine it comes from the microbial protein. And in calves, we knew that there was something going on there,
Mm-hmm.
but because all microbiology papers, as you mentioned, shows that there is an active flora
Mm-hmm.
in the rumen of calves. We just didn't know how much. We couldn't quantify so far how much was that contribution, especially because of the difficulty into estimating all those three
Mm-hmm.
edges of that triangle, because we needed all three of them.
Sure.
Cannulating calves is
No.
very
Yeah.
hard. Like they
Yeah.
don't behave as they should. They most of the time they die. So it
Yeah.
was not an option. So we needed a kind of a different approach as the one we took in this work to come up with a number and understand how important it is for calves.
So you use that cobalt marker.
Mm-hmm.
And then these 60 calves were divided into two separate groups. You've got a low nutrition, a high nutrition. You want to talk a little bit about that and then what the harvest schedule was.
Yeah, so what we did is, as I mentioned before, we fed them at 1 or 2 liters per day to mimic the 4 and 8 liters per day for calves. And what we did is we fed the animals and we harvest those animals immediately after feeding to understand our baseline. And then right after feeding, half an hour, 1 hour, 3 hours, 6 hours, and 12 hours after
Mm-hmm.
feeding. So we understand where is that marker. So if that is in the rumen, if that is in the small intestine or the large intestine or the abomasum. And we were actually able to model the behavior of that marker across all these four compartments. And I believe that with that, we could calculate the area under the curve. And based on this area under the curve
Mm-hmm.
of the marker flow, we could estimate microbial protein production. We focus on the rumen, but we can actually make more calculations. We actually estimated, for instance, passage rate, not only for rumen, but also for abomasum or for the small intestine as well. So we were able to come up with some other numbers that were unknown in the literature, and that
Mm-hmm.
may help us understanding, for instance, start digestion in the small intestine of calves, for instance, in the future. That was not addressed in this paper. There's information there that can be used in a lot other subjects.
Right. Super informative, and I think it's noteworthy to mention that researchers are out there, guys, every day trying to answer these questions to get this baseline knowledge of the black box, right? These baby calves are just, they're a black box. We really don't know until we take the time to study it. So I really applaud you and your team for taking time to craft this beautiful project so that you can capture that. And here's my opportunity to talk to you guys, listeners. If you log in at the bottom of the show notes, there's a clickable link to the open access article. So you can actually see that area under the curve. He's got really nice charts there in the paper that we'll be referencing throughout the results. But again, just know that you have researchers across this nation that are trying to solve this beast and trying to maximize your ability to be as efficient and profitable as possible. And so let's talk a little bit about that leakage that you measured. And okay, so what kind of leakage did you see into the rumen?
Yeah, so that was a very unexpected result. Most of the studies show something between 20 and 30% with those ultrasound measurements that I mentioned before. But actually, our study shows that 56% of the cobalt marker was found in the rumen right after slaughtering. And one thing is important is the method we use to harvest those animals, right? So we first fed the animals, and before euthanizing the animals, we kind of set the animal on the table and hold the animal so the animal wouldn't struggle, and to try to avoid as much as possible some backflow, right? I think we cannot say that we avoided completely, but that was our method. So we restrained the animal as much as possible. We euthanized the animal with KCl, and then the first thing we did is we would open the abdominal cavity, and then we use zip to tie all compartments separately. So to avoid as much as possible, as much reflux as possible. So I'm not saying that it isn't possible that some of that reflux back from the abomasum to the rumen, but we try as much as possible to avoid it.
Sure.
We found about like 50% leakage into the rumen.
Over half.
Yeah, so that was like over half of them. And we really think that that's actually abomasum capacity. It was very clear that the animals in high flow had a little bigger abomasum, so they had a higher capacity. However, in the end, the proportion leaking into the rumen was exactly the same. There was no difference between
the volumes,
the two treatments, which was very unexpected.
That surprised me.
We really thought we would find way more in the high nutrition plan, but we didn't. And that is the beauty of science, right?
Yeah, right.
You are not expecting something you would expect, but actually the animal adapts. So the animal that we fed more milk, they had a bigger abomasum, and the proportion linking to the rumen was exactly the same.
Yeah, isn't that incredible? So talk to me about grain. Were you feeding grain also in both planes of nutrition?
No, and that was because of that kind of the black box you mentioned, right? So you gotta kind of solve the basis first before you come into a more practical situations. We thought a lot about it, and the main reason is we need to understand first what is the animal.
The milk.
We 100% with milk. Like, what is the natural animal, right? An animal with 42 to 45 days in nature, that animal wouldn't eat any grain. So we first needed to understand like the basic biology of the animal itself, and for sure the next step, whenever we have the funds available, the next step is to do it consuming both milk and grain to understand if that is possible. And your question is very important because the consequence on the microbial protein production that we found are even more important if you consider grain intake. So I think your question is relevant, and I think in the future that will be like a next step of this study.
You bet. No, and I wasn't questioning your study design. I try to anticipate what the listeners are
For sure.
questions they might be having, and I suspect that might be one of them. But I applaud you for narrowing it down to just getting the understanding of the milk. And so there was one statement in there that talked about milk replacer versus whole milk, and you were talking about the casein. Can you talk a little bit about that? Because I know some of the listeners definitely are feeding whole milk, and what are some differences that they should anticipate milk replacer versus whole milk?
Yeah, I think there are like 2 points that are relevant to your question. First, I don't see a lot of differences in those behaviors. Maybe the abomination flow will be a little slower if you have whole milk, but passage rate was really high. The empty rate was really high. I don't expect a huge change. It may be a little slower if we use whole milk. I don't really expect a super difference if we use both. That question was really relevant because we use a liquid phase marker. So if we did have casein forming like clots in the abomasum, we may have to use two markers, one for the liquid phase and one for the, like say, solid phase. So for our study that we use milk replacer, we didn't need to use, but I think it was important to highlight that in the paper. The second point we got to make is we're talking about animals producing microbial protein. So milk replacers usually have low fat. And one thing, as we have such a limited microbial population in the room as of now, the question we ask ourselves is that influencing the results?
Yeah.
So the fact that we're using a low fat feed, would that change if we would have used milk instead? So the question is, we always say that if we feed milk, there's no microbial protein. Maybe
because the fat is toxic to the microorganisms?
Maybe the fat is limiting microbial protein intake. So maybe there is something in there.
Okay.
And in the future, we may be talking about rumen protected fat in milk replacer for cats, in high fat milk replacer, something like that. It's just hypothesis at this point, it's just a speculation. But maybe there is something in there. Maybe some of that huge response in microbial protein production we found is linked to a specific feed we were feeding. But those are just speculations at this point.
Sure. And so I guess I just had all these random questions as I was reading your paper, but we haven't talked about the emptying rate yet. Let's talk about what you observed as you were measuring the cobalt. You said it was a really high rate. How long until it fully emptied?
Yeah, so I have some numbers here, but most of the emptying rates, like the rumens, the 3.44 hours, that's the retention rate. So that's how long it would take to empty the whole thing. So that's pretty quick. So the milk stays in the rumen for about 3 hours and the abomasum for another 3 hours. The small intestine, we know it's a much longer organ, so that's about 6 hours. That is very interesting. Like within like 12 hours, the animal is already extremely
ready.
Basically empty, right?
Yeah.
So and that's why it makes sense. In nature, the animal will nurse like several times per day.
Right.
And we're focusing on like 2 feedings per day, which is exactly those 12 hours. So if you sum the 3 hours in the rumen, the 3 hours in the abomasum, the 6 hours in the intestine, I bet that animal is hungry way earlier than that.
Yeah, no wonder they're bawling at us when we get out there.
Yeah. So that also matches some of the benefits where you use like automatized systems, right? Where the animals can drink smaller portions, but several times per day. I bet like also that would change behavior of the animal, right? That will probably change the rate of digestion and how well the animal can use that nutrient. So food for thoughts here, Reagan. I think we need to understand that those numbers are very impressive. It really shows that the animal is hungrier way earlier than we think.
Yeah, wow. Interesting. That's just really fascinating. The wheels in my head are turning. It's impressive. Very cool. This discussion about esophagus and such, it's got me thinking, what about colostrum? Did these kids get the colostrum that they needed? And did you tube feed them, or did you expect them to nurse that volume?
Yeah, there was a very nice dairy goat farm. We were able to actually sort only animals who got a good colostrum. We didn't have to tube any animals. That was one of the selection criteria we excluded, because the animals that were tubed, all animals that received exactly the same colostrum, and they all received 1 liter of colostrum within an hour of birth and another liter of colostrum 12 hours later. So back to your question. Is it possible that some colostrum also leaks from the esophageal groove? I don't have an answer. It is possible. I think it is possible, but I don't have an answer. And your question raised other questions, right?
Yeah.
Does the colostrum, if that leaks
different fat
into the rumen, does that affect something like rumen population or microbial population?
Yeah.
I don't know. I don't have that answer. It's a good question, but I think we need more research to answer that.
Oh, I just love dairy science because you just never, every question leads to another one, right? Uh,
Exactly.
but ultimately, when this leaks into the rumen, you start to see volatile fatty acid production, right?
Mm-hmm.
Okay,
Mm-hmm.
and so that's going to fuel the animal, and in a way. And then I found it really noteworthy. On table 3, you've summarized the amount of microbial protein in grams per day that was generated from both different treatments. Can you speak to what that is relative to the protein needs of the animal? Is it close to what she needs, or is she still very
Mm-hmm.
reliant on the milk replacer going to the small intestine? What are your thoughts on that?
Sure. I think you started with volatile fatty acids, and I'll also highlight ammonia. And it's interesting that because first we do see volatile fatty acids, so we do see VFA. That means that there is fermentation going on over there. So we have an active microbial population. Also, the other point is we did see ammonia in the rumen, which also relates to some microbial activity. Actually, one thing that is very interesting is our level, ammonia level. So we did find something in the high group, 5.44 milligrams per deciliter,
Mm-hmm.
which is, although it's not like it represents a rumen that is not super, super high in activity. However, when you compare, for instance, in a high lactating cow, for instance, us at the minor here, or cows producing 55, 60 liters. It's a
Mm-hmm.
extremely well-balanced diet with very well-balanced for amino acids. Ammonia levels here are between 8 and 9.
Mm-hmm.
So if you compare, you see like, look, a very well-balanced diet for a cow
Mm-hmm.
gets rumen ammonia around like 8 to 10, let's say. And cats in a very well-balanced diet, because the milk is a well-balanced
Mm-hmm.
diet for cats, it's 5.5. So it's pretty close. It's of course it's still low. Of course, it's an undeveloped rumen, but that
Sure.
shows that the rumen
It's doing
within
something.
42, 45 days is
Mm-hmm.
doing something and without concentrate.
Mm-hmm.
Keep in mind that everything that we're talking about
It's without starch. Yeah.
without starch, without starter, without any concentrate. So back to the microbial protein production, that's your second point. So we did find about 2.2 grams per day of microbial protein.
Mm-hmm.
The total protein intake was about 21 grams per day. So we're talking about 10% of that being converted into the microbial protein. And now we'll relate that back to your starter intake. So in a cow, in a good cow, we're talking about 40 to 60%. A high producing cow, probably around 40 to 45% of her metabolizable protein comes from the microbial protein.
Mm-hmm.
A beef cow is probably 60, 70%
Yeah.
is coming from that microbial protein. In calves, we're talking about maybe 10%.
Mm-hmm.
Is that low? I think that absolutely not. I think that is pretty high. 45, 42 to 45 days, we'll be probably eating something around 700, 800 grams of starter per day.
Uh-huh.
So I would think that is probably 20, even higher percent of her
Once you start adding.
metabolizable
Uh-huh.
protein when you start adding the starter. So, and right now, all our models consider that 100% is coming from RUP.
Mm-hmm.
So I think we're missing by at least
Opportunity.
20,
Yeah.
30%. So I think we're missing a huge opportunity here. So we need to I really believe that we need to stop saying that like all the
Zero. Yeah.
protein, it had zero
Mm-hmm.
metabolizable protein coming from microbial protein. That is for sure much higher than that.
Yeah.
And even if as 10%, as we could see in this paper, we saw variations between 10 and 36%. We had calves with 36% coming from that.
Interesting.
So there's a
Yeah.
huge, and that's another point that we didn't mention so far. There's huge animal variation.
Okay.
So is there opportunity in the future to try to sort those animals and understand why some animals were getting only 5 to 10% and why some animals were getting 30% from that?
Isn't that something?
If with exactly the same diet,
Yeah,
that's
that's
something
bizarre.
we basically, yeah, that's something we don't know. That's a huge animal variation and other questions for future and understanding in the future. Yeah.
And I guess
Mhm.
something else I want to throw out there that I find completely fascinating about all ruminants, and just a reminder to all the listeners, that microbial population, or that the microbial protein that flows out of the rumen and feeds and fuels the animal, is nearly the exact amino acid sequence that
Mhm.
she requires. I mean, it's just, she's
Mhm.
such an impressive bovine beast that they can go out there and graze some grass, generate microbial protein in their gut, and it fuels exactly what she needs.
Mhm.
It's impressive. I know, I'm sorry, let's
It's
rewind back
impressive.
to the milk replacer, but just I am so enamored by the bovine, and find a lot of joy in better understanding her and the black box. And I think you've done a great job helping all researchers, all dairy scientists better understand these first 42 days by mapping out the kinetics. There was a little discussion about physiology and hormones and such associated with eating. Do you want to touch on that?
Well, we don't have the results yet, but actually, I do have a student working on that physiology and also histology of the rumen. One thing that I would like to touch is that it was very clear that the animals in high plane of nutrition had a better rumen development.
Mm-hmm.
That was, for instance, IGF-1 was higher in a high plane of nutrition. And we do know, like, there's several studies showing that an animal with a higher energy intake very commonly leads to a higher IGF-1. So the better nutrition status, a higher glucose leads to a higher IGF-1 synthesis. And that stimulates animal and body growth, but maybe rumen development as well. So that's a second step of the study that will come out.
Mm,
And the other thing that we will study in the future is the immunology of those animals. So we did collect samples on especially in the intestine,
awesome.
to understand, because it's very clear that when you feed animals more milk, they usually are more resistant to, especially scours, right? Especially diarrhea.
Yeah.
So maybe I think that's a topic that we should save for the future, especially because
Hmm.
some brand new exciting results will come out in the following year or so.
Yes. Well, I can't wait to read that paper, and I'll be watching the articles in press, and maybe we'll have a 2.0 follow up in that, because that'll be really interesting. When the plane of nutrition is good for the calf, good things just happen. Life is easier when things are just clicking right along, and we can provide that for the animal. So let's see. My favorite question to ask every researcher that I wrap up the podcast with is, what would you like boots on the ground dairy producers listening in to really gain from this baseline project on kinetic? What are some take homes that you want them to gather up?
Well, the more practical aspect, I think there was a lot of talk about feeding more milk, you get more leakage, and that will ferment in the rumen, and you're not using that. I've heard some people saying that, and we can all totally say that no, that is not a reality. You can feed as
Hmm.
much regardless of how much you're feeding. The amount that will leak into the rumen will be the same. And also, it's important that if it leaks into the rumen, the animal is still making use of it.
Hmm.
The rumen is still developing. So the more it leaks, the more development you see. Although, again, it's not the same as a concentrate, but that's our next step, right? So we will match the higher milk with starter intake, probably you're even further stimulating rumen development. So it's not super bad. And also, if it leaks into the rumen, there is microbial protein being produced. And you mentioned several times the quality of the microbial protein. So most of the milk replacer companies, they balance probably lysine, methionine, maybe isoleucine, maybe 3 or 4 amino acids max. We're talking
Hmm.
about microbial protein where we have all the 10 essential amino acids extremely well balanced for the
Hmm.
cat. So although you may lose a little bit on energy efficiency, you are for sure reducing microbial protein that is developing or is helping to develop your animals. I think this study is the very good example to kind of erase some of those bad recommendations that we see out there. I'm sure in the future, and of past results that we've seen, like with the higher plane of nutrition, we have a higher IGF-1, a better growth. So when the animals gain 50% more body weight, For instance, mTOR gene abundance, meaning protein synthesis were much more active in one animal than the other ones. The main novelty, I guess, we'll see, yes, the leakage will be more or less the same, but even though it's leaking, it's still doing something that is very beneficial
Sure,
to the animal.
absolutely. Well, Dr. Marcondes, this has been a great discussion, and I want to thank you for your time. And listeners, I applaud you for taking time out of your day today to learn about those pre-weaned calves and how their rate of esophageal development might be impacting rumen development and therefore their future successes. So I've learned a lot from this conversation, and it's been the April edition of the Dairy Science Digest, which is a monthly podcast project designed to bring the Journal of Dairy Science straight to your ears. We highlight peer-reviewed research articles and press because it's sound science to base your management decisions around and provided to you by your University of Missouri Dairy team. So please be sure to like, share, and subscribe to get future editions straight to your cell phone. This is Reagan Bluel with the Dairy Science Digest, and I hope you have a great day.